On a freezing winter night, a young girl, barefoot and stepping through a pool of her own blood, pounded desperately on a neighbor's window, barely whispering, "They want to kill me. My father, my uncle." Then, silence. No one believed her. No one helped her. 2 weeks later, her body was found in a suitcase, buried 2 meters underground, curled up like a child never given the chance to be born. This was not just a murder. It was the failure of an entire system. And it is the story of a crime called honor. A young woman's body was discovered in a fetal position, placed inside a suitcase, buried approximately 2 meters beneath a residential garden in Birmingham. The suitcase had been sealed with duct tape and partially wrapped in black bin liners. Forensic examination revealed signs of sustained pressure to the neck and jaw, consistent with manual ligature strangulation. Traces of vomit and blood were found on her clothing and within the suitcase lining, indicating asphyxiation accompanied by physical trauma. The positioning of the body suggested containment occurred shortly after death, with minimal post-mortem movement. This concealment method demonstrates a deliberate intent to suppress detection. The use of common household materials for concealment indicates limited logistical resources, but a functional understanding of decomposition timelines and forensic response patterns. The lack of environmental disturbance at the burial site implies that the grave was prepared prior to the killing or within a short time frame post-mortem, with specific attention to concealment rather than disposal. The victim, later identified as Banaz Mahmod, 20 years old, had been reported missing 3 months prior. Initial assessments by local authorities classified her case as non-critical. However, a retrospective review of her communications revealed that she had made multiple visits to police departments over a 12-week period, each time reporting escalating threats to her life. She named specific relatives and described in detail the nature of the danger she faced, including surveillance, coercion, and direct threats of death. Her final written statement included the full names of 5 individuals she believed were planning her murder. This pattern of pre-reporting, combined with the subsequent lack of responsive safeguarding measures, constitutes a systemic breakdown in risk recognition. The victim's credibility was repeatedly questioned, despite her provision of consistent and specific information. Recorded interviews show that she displayed coherent recall, linear chronology, and alignment with corroborated events. This suggests her disclosures were not fabricated or distorted under duress. Audio surveillance conducted weeks after her disappearance captured conversations among male relatives discussing the logistics of her killing. The recordings included admissions of physical restraint, sexual assault, and coordinated role assignment during the act. The tone and content lacked indicators of stress or remorse, instead displaying normalized language patterns associated with task completion. This level of detachment implies that the act was perceived not as a crime, but as a culturally sanctioned resolution. Behavioral indicators point to a group dynamic structured around hierarchical male authority, in which honor is externalized and social compliance is enforced through punitive control. The classification of the killing as an honor-based crime is supported by consistent references to shame, community judgment, and corrective action. The act was not impulsive. It followed surveillance, familial meetings, and decision-making that involved both direct actors and enablers. In the aftermath, community response demonstrated minimal cooperative engagement with investigators. Individuals with potential knowledge of the crime exhibited selective amnesia, conflicting statements, or complete denial of Banaz's existence. This collective withdrawal from factual engagement suggests a shared interest in narrative suppression, possibly due to communal norms regarding loyalty, hierarchy, and social preservation. The forensic psychologist assigned to the case later concluded that the absence of defensive wounds on the victim, despite the prolonged duration of her murder, may indicate either restraint-induced immobility or an advanced level of psychological subjugation. The inability or unwillingness to resist may reflect sustained exposure to coercive conditioning that effectively neutralized her response mechanisms. The burial site, when excavated, showed no signs of animal disturbance or surface disruption. Soil layers had been compacted and recovered with items typical of an active household, including a large freezer. The presence of these objects may have served to obscure scent detection or visual anomalies, suggesting post-murder staging behavior. The positioning of the body within the suitcase, with limbs compressed inward and no attempt at anatomical alignment, indicates an instrumental approach to containment, prioritizing concealment over preservation. The timeline between the final police report and the confirmed time of death spans less than 3 weeks. During this period, at least 2 follow-up inquiries by the victim were recorded, with no corresponding protective intervention initiated. Internal reviews later identified procedural lapses, including the misclassification of her reports, failure to trigger risk protocols, and delayed documentation. The convergence of familial control, communal silence, and institutional inaction created conditions in which psychological coercion could operate unchecked. The suppression of reactive behavior, both by the victim and those surrounding her, may indicate a normalization of subjugation within the social context that surrounded the killing. This environment reduced opportunities for external interruption and contributed to the completion of the crime without immediate detection or witness cooperation. The lack of forced entry, combined with item concealment, may reflect pre-existing psychological conditioning. Banaz Mahmod was born in 1985 in the Sulaymaniyah region of northern Iraq and relocated to the United Kingdom as a child under refugee status, following her family's displacement during the Hussein regime. Her integration into British society occurred under conditions of strict patriarchal control, shaped by traditional Kurdish norms centered on collective honor and gender-based role enforcement. From adolescence, observable restrictions were placed on her autonomy, including regulation of clothing, social interaction, and appearance. These restrictions were consistently enforced by male family members, notably her father Mahmod Mahmod and her uncle Ari Mahmod. At the age of 17, Banaz was entered into an arranged marriage with a male associate from the family's regional network. The husband, significantly older, had recently arrived from Iraq and lacked literacy and linguistic adaptation to his new environment. The marriage was formalized after a single prior encounter. This decision was not the result of personal choice, but rather the outcome of kinship obligation and community expectation. The absence of informed consent in the marital arrangement indicates a high level of dependency on familial authority and reduced self-determination. Subsequent reports and corroborated evidence indicate that the marriage involved multiple instances of coercive control, physical assault, and sexual violence. Banaz disclosed to police that non-consensual intercourse occurred routinely and that physical beatings followed any resistance or defiance. Injuries were documented through photographs and personal notes, although some evidence was later destroyed by the perpetrator. Despite these conditions, familial response upon disclosure was not protective. The family interpreted the abuse as a disciplinary response to perceived disobedience and responded by encouraging Banaz to remain in the marriage and try harder, reinforcing the acceptability of the violence. This dynamic reflects a system of embedded gender subjugation, wherein male authority is maintained through normalized violence and enforced silence. The pattern of resubmission following attempted departure suggests a cycle of coercion sustained by both psychological pressure and institutional gaps in safeguarding. The refusal of the family to acknowledge harm, combined with repeated reintegration into the abusive environment, represents a closed-loop structure resistant to external intervention. At this stage, surveillance behaviors began to intensify, Banaz reported being followed on public streets by unidentified males she believed were affiliated with her extended family. These encounters were described to police as persistent and targeted, often accompanied by verbal intimidation. The operational pattern indicates the use of informal community enforcement mechanisms to monitor and intimidate female members considered non-compliant. This tactic aligns with collective forms of social regulation frequently observed in honor-based control systems. The activation of surveillance suggests the early formation of punitive intent. Behavioral shifts among male family members, such as secretive gatherings, withdrawal from casual interaction with Banaz, and verbalized condemnation of her conduct, marked the transition from internal disapproval to actionable hostility. During this period, Banaz began a private relationship with a man named Rahmat Suleimani, which remained undisclosed to her family. The concealment of this relationship indicates awareness of potential retribution and reflects an attempt to preserve personal agency within a constrained environment. Analysis of retrieved communications between Banaz and Rahmat demonstrates emotional reciprocity, future planning, and the presence of code-switching behavior to conceal messages. The use of encrypted language and temporal avoidance strategies in their interactions denotes fear of interception and confirms the existence of social surveillance networks. Upon eventual discovery of the relationship, verbal threats escalated, and a decision was made within the family to reassert control. A meeting was convened involving senior male members of the extended family, during which Banaz was formally designated as having brought dishonor. This labeling functioned as a trigger event, transitioning the family's behavioral posture from containment to punishment. At this juncture, a prior attempt on the life of Banaz's sister Banaz Mahmod becomes relevant for comparative analysis. Years earlier, Banaz had also attempted to exit the family structure and was subjected to a violent attack by her brother under orders from their father. The sister survived and went into hiding, but did not initiate formal legal proceedings. This precedent establishes a behavioral pattern of intrafamilial enforcement through lethal threat, authorized by patriarchal figures and conducted by subordinate male relatives. The same structural elements re-emerged in Banaz's case, suggesting a repeated deployment of violence as a corrective mechanism. The decision-making process within the Mahmod family did not follow impulsive or reactive lines. Available evidence points to a consensus-based escalation, rooted in ideological justification. The dehumanization of the target through honor discourse enabled emotional detachment and operational coordination. Statements made by family members during subsequent police interviews revealed the use of phrases associated with moral cleansing and purification, consistent with symbolic violence frameworks. Despite multiple disclosures by Banaz to law enforcement, no protective barriers were activated. Internal police communications at the time classified her as unreliable, and procedural actions were delayed or left incomplete. This lack of institutional response contributed to a reinforcement of perceived impunity within the offending group. The absence of meaningful consequences following her initial disclosures likely reaffirmed their belief in the legitimacy of punitive action. The behavioral trajectory from early childhood control to sanctioned violence is characterized by consistent enforcement of role conformity, escalation in punitive intensity upon defiance, and strategic deployment of community pressure. These conditions collectively produced an environment in which Banaz's perceived deviance was not only punishable but narratively justified within the group's internal logic. The specific timing of the surveillance intensification, alongside the discovery of Banaz's independent relationship, requires further examination in terms of triggering mechanisms. Whether the initiation of the punitive phase was based on actual evidence or collective assumption remains analytically relevant. The extent to which decision-making within the family was influenced by perceived external judgment versus internal belief structures is also yet to be fully delineated. Between October 2005 and January 2006, Banaz Mahmod made at least 5 documented contacts with law enforcement authorities across 2 jurisdictions. In each case, she presented consistent verbal statements indicating a credible threat to her life. These statements were recorded in both written and video formats and included specific names, temporal estimates of planned attacks, and descriptions of surveillance activity. Despite this, no comprehensive risk assessment was initiated, nor were formal protection measures enacted. The primary incident occurred at a police station in Croydon, where Banaz disclosed incidents of marital rape, physical assault, and death threats. The interview demonstrated linear narrative construction, clear temporal sequencing, and no observable indicators of cognitive disorientation. The subject referred to past injuries and provided material evidence in the form of photographs and a partial diary. Despite the presence of corroborative details, the case was transferred to West Midlands Police due to geographic jurisdiction. The case file remained inactive for an extended period, and the original statement was not processed into actionable intelligence for several weeks. This sequence illustrates a pattern of bureaucratic inertia. The transfer of responsibility across divisions, without concurrent escalation of threat level, suggests a procedural framework lacking responsiveness to culturally complex violence indicators. The officers involved exhibited behavior consistent with standard response protocols applied to non-critical domestic disputes. This misclassification disregarded the culturally coded language of honor-based threat, which often substitutes direct threats with symbolic or group-based declarations. Shortly after the initial report, Banaz delivered a handwritten letter to local authorities identifying 5 family members as active participants in a plan to kill her. The letter included full names, affiliations, and specific dialogue reportedly overheard between her uncle Ari Mahmoud and her mother. The language used in the letter was declarative and specific. It did not rely on hypothetical or speculative framing. Despite the evidentiary value of the document, no immediate investigation or protective intervention followed. Officers later stated that the victim did not explicitly request action. This reliance on procedural consent, rather than risk-based discretion, contributed to a cumulative failure in threat mitigation. The family's behavioral indicators during this period included increased insularity, abrupt changes in communication routines, and the organization of multiple male-only gatherings at residential locations. The meetings were not acknowledged to law enforcement, but later described by informants as discussions centered on restoring honor. Surveillance data, combined with mobile phone location logs, would later confirm cross-city coordination between male relatives. The language used by family members to describe Banaz in intercepted conversations contained dehumanizing and objectifying terms. These included repeated references to shame, impurity, and the need for cleansing. This shift from relational to symbolic framing marked the formal internal justification for punitive action. The victim was no longer viewed as a family member, but as a threat to communal reputation. During the final week before her disappearance, Banaz appeared at a local hospital with injuries consistent with attempted strangulation and glass laceration. Her explanation for the injuries involved forced intoxication, followed by an attempted ambush inside a relative's home. Hospital staff reported extreme fear responses, including involuntary tremors and dissociation. Despite this, attending officers on the scene considered her account inconsistent and initiated no criminal inquiry. One officer reportedly questioned whether she had broken a window while intoxicated and suggested pursuing criminal damage charges. This incident constitutes a missed forensic opportunity. The presence of physical injuries, eyewitness testimony from civilians at the hospital, and a previous history of reported threats created a convergence of high-risk indicators. The dismissal of these indicators further embedded the perception among the offenders that institutional intervention would not occur. The final documented police interaction involved a verbal account by Banaz in which she stated she had overheard her uncle instructing male relatives to kill her. She repeated the names listed in her previous letter and declined protective measures. This behavior should be viewed not as a withdrawal of consent, but as a manifestation of internalized coercion. victims embedded within closed communal systems often exhibit conflicting survival strategies, balancing disclosure with attempts to avoid triggering immediate retaliation. The sequence of ignored disclosures suggests an institutional framework unable to differentiate between conventional domestic risk models and culturally driven lethal intent. The standard metrics used to assess victim credibility, such as emotional presentation or clarity of recall, were incorrectly weighted against the victim. This contributed to a procedural bias that prioritized administrative completeness over protective urgency. The formation of a council of resolution within the family occurred shortly after Banaz was seen in public with her partner. The sighting was reported to her uncle within hours, indicating the presence of real-time surveillance mechanisms embedded in the local Kurdish community. These mechanisms functioned as informal enforcement tools and were able to activate collective retribution strategies rapidly. The case presents an ongoing analytical requirement, determining the extent to which non-state surveillance systems influenced the timeline and execution of the murder plan. Further inquiry is needed into the operational integration of community reporting channels with intra-familial planning. This may offer insight into how social networks contribute to the concealment, escalation, and rationalization of premeditated violence. On the morning of January 24, 2006, Banaz Mahmod was killed inside her family's home in Mitcham, South London. At the time of the incident, both parents were absent, and the environment was pre-cleared of potential witnesses. Banaz had been staying in the residence under renewed family pressure after multiple attempts to separate herself from the household. This return followed a meeting arranged under the pretext of reconciliation. The three perpetrators, Mohammed Hama, Mohammed Ali, and Omar Hussein, entered the property with prior coordination. Entry was not forced, indicating either possession of keys or cooperation from within the family. Banaz was located in the living room, where she routinely slept due to space constraints. The absence of defensive injuries combined with spatial restriction suggests a rapid immobilization upon confrontation. Audio surveillance recordings, later recovered from private conversations between the suspects, included detailed confessions of the act. The recordings described a sequence involving manual restraint, the use of ligature pressure applied with a makeshift cord, and prolonged force maintained until signs of life ceased. The language used in the recording reflected procedural detachment and collective affirmation of the act's legitimacy within their belief system. The operational structure of the homicide reflected role allocation. One individual applied physical pressure, another secured movement, while a third monitored surroundings. The described method included verbal cues exchanged to coordinate pressure timing and sequence. Statements such as, "The soul was not discharged," and references to repeated stomping on the back of the neck reveal both cultural lexicon and ritualistic framing of the violence. After death was confirmed, the body was concealed in a suitcase. The placement of the corpse involved deliberate compression of limbs and head to fit within the container. This behavior indicates logistical planning and a disregard for post-mortem dignity. The suitcase was then transported approximately 120 miles to Handsworth, Birmingham, where it was buried in the rear garden of a residential property affiliated with a known associate. The burial site had been pre-selected. Forensic excavation confirmed soil displacement matched a time window directly following the murder. Efforts to report Banaz missing were initiated by her partner, Rahmat Suleimani, within 24 hours of her disappearance. Family members did not participate in search efforts or inquiries and provided misleading information when questioned by police. Interviews with community members produced conflicting timelines and numerous accounts of having seen Banaz alive post-disappearance. These statements were later determined to be intentionally false, designed to delay investigation and disrupt probable cause. The missing persons case transitioned into a homicide inquiry under the direction of a specialist unit at Metropolitan Police. Early stages of the investigation were hindered by the lack of cooperation and the deliberate dissemination of false leads. Surveillance intelligence identified travel movements of the three primary suspects between London and Birmingham in the days immediately following the murder. Vehicle hire records linked to Mohammed Hama showed specific geographic clustering near the burial site. Data retrieved from GPS navigation systems confirmed round-trip travel that aligned with the estimated time of body disposal. Aerial reconnaissance was deployed to scan known properties affiliated with the suspects. Footage captured a large white freezer in the garden of the Handsworth address. The freezer was recognized by detectives from prior video surveillance related to community monitoring. A subsequent warrant led to a full-scale excavation. The suitcase containing Banaz's body was recovered 6 feet underground. Soil layers showed deliberate backfill and tampering. The depth and compaction of the burial indicated intent to delay detection beyond typical search depth parameters. The suspects were apprehended in phases. Mohammed Hama was arrested in the United Kingdom and later charged with murder based on audio admissions and corroborating forensic timelines. Muhammad Ali and Omar Hussein fled the country prior to formal charges. Both traveled to Iraq, where familial and political connections delayed extradition proceedings. Intelligence from community sources confirmed their presence in Sulaymaniyah and Erbil, respectively. Reports indicated continued boastful recounting of the murder within local Kurdish enclaves, demonstrating a sustained lack of remorse. A multi-year diplomatic effort followed. This operation represented the first known extradition of murder suspects from Iraq to the United Kingdom. Legal cooperation was established through a temporary memorandum and required physical presence of British officers in Iraq to present evidence before regional magistrates. Both fugitives were eventually located, arrested, and returned to the UK for trial. The psychological posture of the offenders throughout the process showed no deviation from initial justification. Statements made during recorded prison conversations and intercepted messages consistently framed the murder as corrective, not criminal. This fixed belief structure limited the effectiveness of rehabilitation analysis and provided a basis for preventive assessments in similar cases. During trial proceedings, family members refused to testify, and several community witnesses invoked memory lapses or claimed linguistic misunderstandings. One exception was Banaz Mahmod, the victim's sister, who testified against her own relatives under protection. The presentation of her testimony introduced prior patterns of attempted violence within the family unit, affirming the presence of an established enforcement model. Forensic anthropological analysis of the burial context concluded that the position of the body indicated early post-mortem placement. Decomposition stages were consistent with the timeline established by digital evidence. No accelerants or chemical agents were used, indicating the priority was concealment, not destruction. This supports the hypothesis that the act was not intended to erase evidence, but to symbolically and physically eliminate the perceived source of dishonor. The case file included over 100 witness statements, 1,400 exhibits, and extended surveillance records. Operational data revealed a total of 52 individuals who knowingly withheld information or actively participated in obstruction. These behaviors suggest the existence of a localized cultural framework, wherein collective silence serves as a defense mechanism. Further examination is needed to determine the psychological impact of collective reinforcement on individual decision-making within honor-based offenses. This includes assessing whether non-participating relatives exhibited cognitive dissonance or moral disengagement when faced with the act's consequences. Following the conviction of the primary offenders in the murder of Banaz Mahmod, long-term behavioral shifts became evident within multiple systems connected to the case. The surviving members of the immediate family demonstrated polarizing psychological responses, including sustained avoidance, retraction of statements, and selective denial of prior events. These behaviors are consistent with post-crisis dissonance, especially in contexts where familial cohesion is culturally prioritized over external accountability. The sister of the victim, Banaz Mahmod, entered long-term protective housing and adopted a concealed identity following her cooperation with law enforcement. Her actions, including courtroom testimony against family members, reflected a deviation from expected in-group loyalty structures. This deviation illustrates the psychological cost of internal whistleblowing in environments defined by honor-based value systems. Her behavior suggests an adaptive shift toward externalized moral frameworks, despite the persistent threat of retributive harm. The lack of subsequent testimony from other relatives further highlights the durability of coercive silencing in similar cases. Within the broader community, observable behavior included minimization, rationalization, and non-engagement with judicial outcomes. Statements made to investigators and the media consistently downplayed the presence of systemic violence. This public positioning aligns with image preservation tactics frequently observed in collectivist cultural systems under scrutiny. The pattern of strategic disengagement may indicate a communal response rooted in risk containment, rather than acknowledgement of harm. Continued denial of the family's role by remaining members reinforces this conclusion. The investigative bodies involved in the case initiated internal policy revisions following the outcome. Law enforcement reports identified procedural deficiencies, including the failure to interpret early threat signals, the misclassification of reports, and the absence of trauma-informed interviewing protocols. These acknowledgments led to the implementation of specialized units trained in handling honor-based violence and coercive control. The introduction of targeted awareness programs reflects an institutional recognition of threat models that fall outside conventional domestic violence paradigms. Forensic analysis of the case confirmed that the act was not reactive or situational, but premeditated and ideologically driven. The planning, execution, and post-offense concealment demonstrated operational discipline and internal consensus among offenders. The behavioral profile observed does not align with impulsivity or individual pathology, but instead reflects group adherence to a socially reinforced code. This distinction has implications for classification, risk assessment, and prevention strategies in cases involving cultural frameworks that prioritize collective honor. The psychological aftermath among investigative personnel also requires consideration. Multiple officers involved in the inquiry later cited prolonged exposure to cultural denial, victim dehumanization, and obstructive group behavior as contributing factors to professional burnout. This reinforces the need for structured support mechanisms for personnel engaged in high-resistance investigative environments. The inability to rely on conventional witness cooperation and the requirement to reconstruct timelines from indirect evidence added operational complexity and investigative fatigue. The lasting impact of the case on the British criminal justice system lies in its illustration of systemic gaps in recognizing and responding to culturally coded threats. Traditional risk assessment tools failed to capture the lethal potential of perceived dishonor within insular family systems. The absence of overt physical escalation prior to the homicide contributed to a false sense of safety. This miscalibration between perceived and actual risk suggests a need to re-examine how law enforcement frameworks account for non-Western forms of control and violence. Banaz Mahmod's case functions as a reference model for analyzing honor-based violence within diaspora communities. The act was not an anomaly, but a result of structured reinforcement, psychological conditioning, and collective justification. The challenge for future intervention lies not in the visibility of harm, but in the detection of intent when expressed through culturally normalized language and behavior. What are your thoughts on the behavioral conclusions presented here? Do you agree with this interpretation, or would you classify it differently?